I call Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise and take a call on this third reading of the Animal Welfare Amendment Bill on behalf of New Zealand First. Mr Speaker, I want to pick up on a couple of points that Mr McKelvey made earlier, and one of them was actually about pest control, when he talked about pest species of animals that we have in this country. And it's quite interesting that at this time the subject of 1080 is topical, Mr Speaker, because 1080 is actually an extremely inhumane form of pest control. And it's curious, in fact, that it wasn't included in the ambit of this bill. But perhaps that's a question for another day. It's something that we can revisit. Mr McKelvey also spoke about the export of live animals for slaughter, and Mr O'Connor touched on that, and the Minister has said a word about it as well, Mr Speaker. And I want to talk primarily about the export of live animals because it's probably the major lingering concern that New Zealand First still has with regards to this bill. And during the first reading, I expressed some reservations that New Zealand First held regarding the export of live animals for slaughter. And of course, under the existing Act, this is prohibited unless it is specifically authorised by the Director General of MPI. And we asked at the time whether or not, that being the case, whether this bill presented an opportunity to do away with that provision altogether. Mr Speaker, New Zealand used to export animals for slaughter on quite a large scale, and the practice was brought to a halt by the Parliament some years ago for what were very sound reasons at the time. And there were, and are of course, other reasons as well, economic reasons, but the motivation at the time was primarily centred on the conditions which the animals were subjected to, both while they were being transported to other places, and the conditions that they were subjected to when they arrived at the other end. New Zealand First has got no objection, Mr Speaker, to the export of live bloodstock, because we understand full well just how valuable the thoroughbred industry is to this country. We know that our bloodstock is highly regarded and highly sought after internationally, and that many thousands of jobs and literally hundreds of millions of dollars are generated in the economy through the export of live horses. But horses are treated in an entirely different manner to sheep and cattle intended for slaughter in as far as the way that they are transported and cared for. Horses are air freighted to their destinations in pressurised air-conditioned comfort. They're housed in safe, secure environments while on the airplane, and they have veterinary care. And of course, on arrival, their fate is not to be taken to the nearest abattoir, but rather to a training track or a stud farm. And these are valuable animals, and they are cared for accordingly. And breeding heifers are similarly afforded a better lot than cattle and sheep, which left these shores a decade or so ago, destined for the slaughterhouses of distant places. New Zealand First doesn't believe that we should be exporting such animals either, Mr Speaker, but we recognise that while it is legal, there are people who will see it as good business and who will look to profit from it. We're opposed because we believe such practices are short-sighted, Mr Speaker, and as I've said in debates on other legislation, notably the DERA Act, we believe that business activity of this type will come back and bite New Zealand. The reason for that, Mr Speaker, is that one day the dairy bubble is going to burst. We've allowed ourselves in this country to come to the belief that because we hold such a major position in terms of global cross-border trade in dairy products, that we're somehow significant in terms of world milk production, and we're not. New Zealand produces only around 3% of the world's milk. Most dairy produce worldwide is consumed domestically in the country of origin, and international trade comprises only a very small proportion of the total. At the moment, there is a shortfall between supply and demand, and it is this which allows New Zealand to profit from being in a position to supply from our disproportionately large dairy production relative to our population and domestic demand to buyers from overseas. But in helping to grow production overseas through joint ventures and by selling heifers to foreign dairy producers, we are only hastening the arrival of the day when demand for dairy products in the countries that are presently our export markets will be met from production in those countries. For that reason, we do not believe that it's sustainable or even a good idea to export live dairy cows, regardless of the conditions under which they are transported. And of course, New Zealand does also export other animals for breeding purposes, including cattle and sheep and goats and deer and even chickens. And our animals are very much sought after worldwide because they are known to be, for the most part, from very good stock lines and also, for the most part, free from many of the nasty diseases that are endemic in some other parts of the world. And again, Mr Speaker, animals which are exported for breeding purposes are treated and transported in far greater safety and comfort than those which are destined for the pot. But the issue of live exports for slaughter has not gone away, Mr Speaker, and in fact it's raised its head only in this last week just gone with the Prime Minister's efforts towards securing a free trade deal with the nations of the Middle East Gulf Cooperation Council. This deal has been on hold since 2009, and coincidentally one of the sticking points is the fact that New Zealand halted live sheep exports in 2004. Apparently, an investor from Saudi Arabia lost quite a bit of money as a result of the cessation of exports, and we're told that the Saudis are still a wee bit sore about that. But that aside, these exports were put on indefinite hold at that time for very good reason. And as a nation, we had engaged in live export for slaughter for more than 20 years prior to that. But in 2003, something like 5,000 sheep died on one ship under what could only be described as quite horrific conditions while being transported from Australia to Saudi Arabia. And they died from heat stress, overcrowding, lack of food, water and sanitation during a sea voyage which had lasted something like 2 months longer than it should have done. And so New Zealand First is very much concerned that such exports may be resumed and that provision for the resumption still exists under the bill. We're concerned on a number of fronts, Mr Speaker, but they all come back to animal welfare in one way or another. Obviously, we're concerned that if live exports for slaughter were to be resumed, we'd be faced with a return to the very same conditions which led to their being curtailed in the first place. And it's hard to see how that could be avoided, because these things are driven by money. And sheep are crammed into overcrowded boats because the cost of transporting them has to be kept down, because a live sheep being exported for slaughter isn't worth very much. In fact, it's probably the lowest return for both the farmer and the nation that can be received for a sheep that's been grown for consumption. And we do know, Mr Speaker, that things haven't improved very much in that regard in the last 10 or 15 years, because live exports from Australia have continued pretty much unabated since that time. And the standard of transport today is much as it was then. And in fact, collateral losses for sheep exports from Australia to other parts of the world are running at about 7 or 8%. Maybe a little bit less than that, but it's still too much by any measure. And it's the minimal value of the animal and the minimal return to the farmer and to New Zealand Inc. Which we oppose, and for the same reasons we do not wish to see any part of our primary sector reduced to a simple exporter of bulk commodities. The second concern that we have is around the conditions which might meet livestock exported for slaughter when they arrive at the other end of their journey. And we know that the Director-General can grant an exemption if he or she is satisfied that the abattoir in the destination country meets the standards that we demand here. But the reality is that in too many cases, live animals are sought in other parts of the world for reasons of ritual slaughter in accordance with the requirements of various religious and other cultural practices. And these practices, Mr Speaker, by their very nature are not able to meet the minimum standards of animal welfare which we demand of our own meat processors. Animals are required to be fully conscious when they're put to death, which is at odds with our own requirement that they be stunned first. They are frequently transported in the boots of cars, even in the back seats of cars. They are not properly restrained. They are subjected to quite brutal and stressful treatment prior to slaughter. And we have an objection also, Mr Speaker, to the granting of the exemption being placed in the hands of the Director-General, however professional he or she might be. Mr Speaker, the practice of exporting live animals for slaughter was stopped by politicians through the parliamentary process, and we believe that if it is to be resumed, then that decision must be made in the same way. We don't believe it's good enough for a minister to be able to hide behind a bureaucrat if and when this decision ever is to be made. And governments need to take responsibility for changes of this magnitude, and we believe that if a minister wishes to restart the export of live animals for slaughter, then he or she should be required to put their money where their mouth is and stand behind that decision and stand up for it if and when necessary. And necessary is a salient point, Mr Speaker, because over the last decade or so, we've shown that exports of live sheep for slaughter from New Zealand are not necessary. The New Zealand farming sector has got on quite well without them for the last decade, and it appears that customers in the Middle East have got on quite well without those exports as well. So it's simply not necessary, and we ask again why it's been removed altogether and why we didn't make provision for prohibiting it in total when the bill went through. But all that said, Mr Speaker, on balance, this is still a very good bill, which will deliver very much better and improved outcomes for animal welfare in New Zealand, and New Zealand First continues to support it. Mr Speaker, I commend it to the House. Thank you.
I call Barbara Kura.